Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you joining us for this very special Friday Forum. My name is Cyndy McDonald, and I am the distinct privilege of being your host for the Friday Forums. And I get a chance to talk to experts in lots of different areas throughout the world. So I'm very pleased today to have a very special guest as part of our Friday Forum. And as you're joining, please let us know where you're from. Use the chat box to put in the location that you're joining us from, and that'll give you an idea of the broad range of attendees and audience that we have for my Friday Forums. I'm very pleased to introduce my special guest for today. Many of you've read his books. Edward Fiske. He is the author of the best-selling Fiske Guide. This has been in edition since 1981, you said, Dan? This was the first one?
The first one, yeah.
And Ted is New York Times. He was the education editor for the New York Times. He's been a journalist. He's a best-selling author. And so pleased to have you with me today on our Friday Forum. Welcome.
Glad to be with you, Cyndy. Thanks.
So I'm wondering, what prompted you to be a journalist in the first place? Is this something you always wanted to do, or did this turn into something from something else? What?
Well, Cyndy, I guess it was something I always did. I mean, I was the editor of my high school magazine and my college newspaper and a graduate school newspaper. So it was just something I kind of always did. And I was interested in journalism. I was also interested in religion. And after I graduated from Wesleyan University in Connecticut, I got a degree in theology, master's in theology from Princeton Theological Seminary. And I was working at a church in Harlem. And then while I was there in New York, I used to write for the local Amsterdam News. But then I went to the New York Times and ended up covering religion for the New York Times. So I was able to combine my two interests. And it was exciting time in religion. It would have been in the mid to late 60s. It was the post-Vatican II period where I was writing stories, essentially watching a medieval institution take on modernism, the Enlightenment, and the New Left all at once. And so I was always writing leads, like for the first time since Martin Luther or something like that. And then there was the rise of all the cults and the sects in the early 70s. And so I did a lot of it, which is a very different kind of reporting. So I covered that movement. And then after about 10 years, I was looking for another challenge. And I was expecting to go on the foreign staff, but then they said, we need an education editor. How'd you like to do that? And so I switched over to education. People often ask how you go as a journalist from covering religion to covering education. And I guess my snide answer is I got to be very good at dealing with people who held firmly to dogmatic beliefs. So it served me well in religion by definition, but also in education. But actually, from a journalistic perspective, they're very similar jobs. It's just the subject matter is different. But I really was very fortunate. I covered two really interesting areas for the New York Times.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. And to be a part of that during the 60s and 70s, when there was so much change, and just see that firsthand, how exciting is that? So we have people, Ted, from Honduras, Rhode Island, Arizona, Boston, Connecticut. We just have people from just all over the world that are Dominican Republic. I'm just seeing people from just everywhere, and many people are just saying, Bogota, Colombia. So you have lots of fans out there.
Welcome, citizens of the world.
So, so then what prompted, so you started writing for the New York Times on the education. So what prompted you to start writing the Fiske Guide? And was there something in particular in 1980, 81 that prompted you
Yeah.
to do that?
Well, you think back to the times, the early 80s was when the last of the baby boomers were finishing going through college. So you had a decline in the number of high school graduates. And some colleges were getting pretty desperate about how to fill up their classes. So they became very aggressive in marketing and pushing themselves. And now by current standards, this all seems rather quaint. Marketing consisted of 4-color brochures in mailboxes and maybe an occasional video or something. But anyway, they were doing, and ended up doing a lot of crazy things, so I had a lot of fun writing about this story, both for the Times. I did an article for Atlantic Monthly, then called Atlantic Monthly, about it. But like, for example, I remember there was a college in I think Indiana, somewhere in the Midwest, which is of course absolutely flat. And there was a heavy rainstorm one day, and there was a huge puddle that accumulated in the central campus, the central green of the campus. So an alert photographer from the PR office went over, and he got some students to sit by this edge of this puddle, which sort of looked like there was a lake in the middle of the campus. In fact, it was a big puzzle. And so he got these students to sit by the edge, and then they used the picture in the next view book. Unbeknownst to the editors, however, 2 of the students up at the top of the picture were smoking joints. And so it was a little embarrassing to the college, but who knows, it may have really increased the number of applications they got.
There's somebody like me. I can relate to that.
Like I'll fit in. I can go. I don't know how many people asked where the lake had gone, but anyway, it was a lot of fun doing this. But seriously, what happened? The result was you had the colleges with all this wave of sophisticated, or maybe by current standards, not so sophisticated propaganda, but somebody had to kind of come in and cut through this and come in on the side of the consumer. So the New York Times had a book publishing arm at that point, and they wanted me to write a book. And so we created what started out as the as the New York Times Selective Guide to Colleges. So it started out as an official New York Times publication. But the fact was, I was saying things in the guide that I couldn't really, it wouldn't be appropriate to write about in the newspaper. I mean, I couldn't say, the food at Syracuse University tastes terrible or something, And so some people complained to the publisher, and the publisher said, "Yeah, you're right." And he was right. It was 2 different kinds of publications and 2 different kinds of writing. So they said, "Okay, we're going to take the New York Times name out of it, but you can have the book." So it was a win-win situation. I got a lot of publicity, and then it eventually evolved, because everybody simply started referring to it as a Fiske Guide. It eventually evolved into the Fiske Guide to Colleges. And the thing that we were doing, and this is sort of important, that we still do, and I think that still distinguishes the Fiske Guide from other similar publications, is that we're really trying to focus on and convey the institutional culture, the institutional personality. And this is something which evolves, but very slowly. I mean, you find that even like schools in the 70s that were going co-ed for the first time, the men at Vassar are sort of culturally not that different from the women who had been Vassar for century or so. So the personalities of these schools tends to be pretty much the same. And we keep up with data and enrollment trends and statistics and all that. But the main thing that we're doing in the Fiske Guide is conveying those distinctive institutional personalities. And there was a sort of a dramatic example of this with the first edition of the guide, as I say, back when it was still New York Times Guide, with the University of Pennsylvania. And we noticed in the, we get questionnaires from the administration, and then we get questionnaires from students as to what it's like to be at the school. And in the responses from the students at Penn, in Philadelphia, of course, there was kind of an undercurrent of anti-intellectualism. And I couldn't figure out what this meant. What was an Ivy League school doing with this kind of leitmotif running through the questionnaire? So I put it aside and started interviewing people. There's a sociologist named Digby Baltzel who wrote about Penn's, how the Philadelphia aristocracy dealt with its university and all. And what I basically figured out was that Penn was founded by Benjamin Franklin way back in colonial time, who was sort of, as one of the former presidents of the university says, it was the ultimate visionary and pragmatist. And he was a guy who was very learned, he was a good scientist, but for whom knowledge was sort of, first of all, practical, and only then and in itself. And even though I grew up in Philadelphia, I didn't realize that the liberal arts tradition, the humanities tradition at Penn was pretty much a post-World War II development. The Penn made its reputation over the years with the first medical school, the first business school, the first journalism school, first psychological clinics and all. So it became a great university in ways that would have appealed to Benjamin Franklin. And even to this day, Penn is a leader in service learning and service research and things like that. So to make a long story short, the idea that the values of some guy who lived 250 years ago were still showing up unprompted in the questionnaires of current undergraduates was just mind-boggling. But it was an example of how the institutional culture and values get set and persist over long periods of time. And so that's what we try. We have narrative descriptions of what it's like to be, and we take account of the history. And even schools that look the same, and this was a sort of an editorial risk. Once you've written about the 17th small liberal arts college in Ohio, where the faculty often invite the students to their homes for dinner, they would all sound like alike, and it'd be a pretty dull book. Turns out that's not a problem. Even schools that look alike have very different personalities. And what we try to do in the Fiske Guide is to sort of capture those unique personalities. And then the reader, the student, or the parents can decide, is this a good match for me?
Well, and that is something that has endured through the years, and what we as advisors and counselors and people that are working with students are really strive to is to find that culture and that unique personality. And now with COVID, the students can't go visit, and I were talking about that earlier. And so they're going to have to rely on things like your guide to be able to really find that and identify that. So are there some other ways, that you've watched the education evolve over all these years, almost 40 years? How does it compare to what we have now to what was when you first started?
Well, the most obvious blaring thing is that higher education is a lot more expensive, but that's another whole issue. But in a way, when you think about the evolution of the Fiske Guide, incidentally, do people know what the Fiske Guide looks like?
Yeah, let's show them. Let's let them see what
I
the
happen
Fiske
to have
Guide
a
looks
copy.
like.
It's somebody called it the green monster.
And notice it's the 2021 edition. It
My
just
wife-
came out in June, right?
Right, comes out every June, new edition. Yeah, my wife tells me it's too big. Anyway, that's another issue. But in a way, we've sort of come full circle, because, as I said before, the impetus for the guide in the first place was to help the consumer come in give consumers a weapon against all the propaganda that was coming from the colleges. And now we're in another situation. The number of sort of traditional college students anyway is declining, and so colleges that make a specialty of serving traditional college students and all are scurrying to attract students. And so they're looking for, instead of sending out 4-color brochures, they're hiring enrollment managers. They're managing the admissions by playing games with early decision, or with financial aid, or with discounting. I mean, it's the college's capacity to innovate in order to manipulate the applicant pool is astonishing. So in a way, although lots of things are different, we're still in the situation where and then there's all this barrage of information. There's no problem getting information about colleges. You go on their website, or you can go on social media, or whatever. Problem is, too much information is, for all practical purposes, useless information. So how do you cut through all this barrage of facts that are out there and get some truth or some wisdom or some general conclusions? So in a sense, despite the surfeit of information there, the original purpose of the Fiske guide, that is to say, cutting through all this information and propaganda and figuring, what are the core things we need to know about a school, is now as relevant as ever. So there are a lot of ironies here, and that's one of them.
That is true. That is definitely the case, and more so now than ever, because now the students are getting, and we as advisors are getting bombarded with, virtual fairs and things like that, which are all very valuable, but we need a way to sift through that, and having a guide is really important. So something that I've asked, and many other people are asking too, is how do you choose the colleges and to be in the guide? And do you ever add colleges or take colleges away from the guide?
Well, this is a question. I get a lot of emails from frustrated parents who say, my daughter is interested in St. Fidgeta in the Woods or some school how come it's not in the Fiske guide? And so I have to figure out diplomatic ways of explaining that. But I mean, we have about 325 schools out of the 2,200 or so four-year schools, colleges, and universities, depending on how you count. So we have to make a lot of hard choices, and I always emphasize, just because the school is not in the guide does not mean that it's not a worthy place and might be the perfect place for any particular kid. But our basic principles are this. First of all, what we're looking for we're trying to describe what we judge to be the best and most interesting colleges in the country. So the primary thing is we're looking for academic quality. So every school in the book we consider to be a really good academic value. So that's a given. And there are probably maybe 200, 225 obvious if you take this category, and selectivity tends to be part of this, because the most selective school, there are reasons that the most selective schools are the most selective, because they're good schools. So there are probably about 200, maybe a little more, sort of easy choices. So all of the major flagship universities, the Ivies, and so forth. But then beyond that group, what we're looking for is to serve particular niches of readers. So there's students who so we try to have a collection of HBCUs, of evangelical schools, of Jesuit schools, single sex, schools focusing on environmental issues or engineering. So we try to have for any particular readers, there's going to be at least a few schools that would be serving their particular needs. And then the last, when I said the best and most interesting, I'm still a journalist. I want the book to be fun. And colleges, I mean, one of the diversity of American higher education is it's the best quality. The diversity is the best, the defining feature actually of American higher education. We got big schools, little schools, public schools, private schools, single sex. There's a diversity of type that's unique in the world. In Europe, you tend to go to the local university. So what I want it to be able to do is tell the stories about some of these really interesting schools. So there's no logical reason why we would include a place like College of the Atlantic in a guide is selective. They have 320 students sitting in Bar Harbor, Maine. All they do is teach about ecology. Is one, yeah. But it's a really unique, interesting place. And if you're looking for environmental studies, take a look at College of the Atlantic. You're not going to be very many people that would be potentially interested, but there's some. And so what we try to do is to have a few schools anyway that would meet the needs of any particular student and family.
Well, that makes sense. So having those different aspects is what goes into the guide, and it's obviously working because it's the #1 college guide on the market. And so you mentioned that there's a process. So you have students fill out questionnaires, and then the administration. What else goes into the process of?
Well, what we do is each year we send out a questionnaire to the colleges, and it used to be when we first did it, the questionnaires tended to be filled out by the admissions office, but over the years, colleges have built up their institutional research offices. So typically it goes to the institutional research people, and then they farm out certain questions to other people. So we get the core information about the school. And that's our way of keeping track of new curriculum requirements. If they change their general ed requirements, that will be how we learn about it. And then new buildings. We try to keep up with one of the things over the recent years, colleges have been putting huge amounts of money into new sports facilities and things to make students happy. And so we keep up with that, and that's just a way of updating and keeping relevant. And then when we ask the colleges to select a few students, and I don't like discussing my methods with social scientists because they tell me that what we do doesn't work and never could work. But all I can say is, well, it has worked for really 4 years. So don't ask me to explain why, but it does. And we asked them to select some students to fill out questionnaires, or essentially questions: what is it like to be a student? How would you characterize your fellow students? What's the food like? What's the dorms like? What's the social scene like? How do you have to belong to a fraternity or sorority to have a decent social life, or can you be an independent? All these kinds of stuff, and they're all unanswered. They're all open-ended questions. So we don't. Every once in a while, in the early days, we would have a few code words, say, "Is your college this or that?" And then all we did, we kept getting our own words sent back to us. So we've learned how to ask students these questions. And people often say, well, you're letting the schools select the students, so they're just going to give you a rosy picture. And again, it's worked. The fact is that students will tell it like it is.
Mm-hmm.
No university administration can control what a bunch of students are going to say. And so that's important. So we found that the answers to be pretty authentic. It also protects us against questionnaires falling into the hands of students who have a grudge. Yeah. So we in 40 years or close to 40 years of doing this, we've never had a situation where a student who really had something against the school, where that got through our screening process. So it's worked, and so the narrative write-ups just include a lot of student quotes, and so that's how we do it, and anyway, that's how it works.
Oh, good. So now the guide has a rating system, and that's one of the things that I have found very helpful, is to be able to show, and I think like the quality of life, the academic, those kinds of things are very valuable, and it's part of that discerning process. How did you come up with the rating system, and what goes into that?
Well, okay. First of all, to make it clear, I do not rank schools a la U.S. News, because I consider that essentially dishonest. I mean, there are lots of reasons why you would rank them. Don't rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Say this is school's number 27, this one is 42. That's just nonsense. And the main problem with that is when you're asking the wrong question. The question is not what's the best school, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The question is what's the best school for me, given given my needs and aspirations and so forth. What's going to be the best fit? So you can't, in an absolute sense, reduce any complex institution like a college or university down to a single number and say this is better than that. So that's important. I do not rank. Okay, but the model for our ratings, and we, as you suggested, we rate, we give students, give colleges up to 5 stars in academics, social life, essentially meaning the amount of social life, and then quality of life, which was essentially the quality of life. And these are inherently subjective. The model for this is, I'm a journalist, is the restaurant critic awarding stars to restaurants. So it's admittedly subjective, and different people will have different rankings. And I don't encourage, don't compare 2 schools because one has 4.5 stars and another has only 4. But on the other hand, it can be useful as a sort of an index for using the book. I mean, if, for example, you really want to find a party school, then look for schools that have 5 stars for social life. Yeah, so you can use it to sort of compare schools, or you can look for schools with a particular pattern, or you can look for schools with a certain academic level. But again, these are subjective, and but the rankings, or the ratings that appear in the margin there should be pretty obvious from the write-up itself. So I think of them as essentially as sort of a shorthand for what the write-up is. And I would hope that most people reading the write-up would probably come up with similar set of ratings. And so it's essentially a way of you navigating the book and looking for, if you find 1 or 2 schools that you really like, finding other schools that have similar kinds of balance. So the ratings flow out of the narrative.
And I think that's an important point to bring up with the students and the parents as we work with them too. One is there is a big difference between ratings and rankings, and that having the ratings is no way equivalent to a ranking. So I'm glad you emphasized.
The other big problem with the rankings is that they are essentially measures of input, or to put it more crassly, the wealthier the school, the better its ranking. And if you look at all the criteria and the formulas, it's all input. It doesn't take any account of what happens to the student once they get there. Yeah, what's the quality of the teaching like? It's all on how, and you notice over the years, the number of public schools, good public universities among the top schools has declined. And I can't believe that the UC Berkeley is, example, or University of Michigan, say, or Indiana, its quality, relative quality has declined over the years. But the fact is, the way the formula is written, schools that tend to get wealthier get higher rankings. So it's, and what we, as I mentioned before, what we're trying to do is look at the institutional culture and the quality of the teaching, and whether students ever see their faculty member, a full professor before they reach their junior year. These are the kinds of things that are really important, not the size of the endowment or the percentage of alumni who give. So we could spend another couple of sessions just on the problems with rankings. So, but you probably don't want to do that.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here, because none of us, most of us are always combating that image, and especially with international students, because so often they feel like the rankings are, very authoritative, might even come from the US government, and and that it's a really important factor. And we're always trying to explain to them that it's not, it's more of a marketing thing. So a couple of questions that I'm going to pose that are coming from the audience. We have anonymous, a viewer who said it would be interesting to hear the type of changes you and your editor have made to new editions. So are there things that you've added over the years or found that didn't work and you took out? What are some changes that have been made?
Well, there's been some evolution over the years in the kind of concerns that people have. For example, in the 90s, there was a lot of concern about campus safety. And so we started asking questions about that. In recent years, there's been, most recently, the whole issue of sexual assault and what are colleges doing to deal with that. And so in the last few years, we've started asking more questions about what colleges have been doing to deal with this issue. At the moment, we're trying to figure out how to deal with sort of the whole issue of structural racism. Mm-hmm. And we're going to be the next editions, we're going to be doing some probing about how the colleges, and we reported things like Georgetown has been doing a lot to deal with its legacy of slavery and all that. So as social issues come and go, we try to respond and affect the colleges. We try to be responsive to that. So that's happening, and that's a continuing process. And 10 years from now, there'll probably be other issues that we'll be dealing with. I guess one of the issues is right now, the events are sort of outrunning the content of the write-ups. We have a book, the next 2022 edition will come out next June, as you say, end of June. And it's still going to be describing on-campus culture, but right now it's hard to define what is on-campus culture. But we have to sort of assume that eventually things are going to become normal. And as I've said a couple of times, institutional cultures and procedures and personalities persist. So there's sort of an article of faith here that that whatever havoc COVID raises to admissions procedures, and who gets in, who doesn't, who attends, who doesn't. Whatever changes, those changes will eventually pass, and colleges will sort of return to some semblance of normalcy, and that the basic fundamental personality and culture is going to reestablish itself. So at this point, there's no way you can write about this in a definitive way today that would still be true next week, because colleges don't know what they're doing, and admissions offices certainly don't know what they're doing, or they're doing their best to try to judge what's happening. So we like to think that in this kind of a culture, what we're trying to do is as relevant, perhaps more relevant than ever before, because you can't visit the campus. You can't go talk to students. Well, you can maybe by chat or something, but you don't have the opportunity to go onto a campus and absorb this culture and the institutional personality firsthand. So we're hoping that this Fiske guide can be a help in doing this until such time as you can begin to resume normal ways of sizing up a school.
So in these exploration that you're doing in terms of systemic racism, is that including other things about equity, or somebody asked about, let's see, just in terms of equity and access, I guess is the term that I'm looking for.
I should have mentioned this before. This is one of the issues that's come up within the last 5 or 6 years. We started the whole question of economic discrimination. And so we started, goodness knows, it must have been 6 or 8 years ago, reporting the percentage of Pell recipients there are in the student body. That would be sort of a surrogate for economic diversity and for for responsiveness to first generation college students and so forth. And we started asking questions about this. So if you look at most of the write-ups for the last 5 or 6 years, there will be some mention of the extent to which it serves the school is serving an economically diverse group of students, both in the write-ups and then in the statistic percent of Pell recipients. I mean, there are still schools, some really good schools, that were fewer than 10% of their classes are Pell recipients, which is sort of mind-boggling today. I won't embarrass them by mentioning them now. But in the write-ups, if a school has above 30 or 35%, we tend to mention that in the write-up. If their Pell ratio is around 17, 18, 21%, we don't mention it. The statistic can speak for itself. But if colleges are doing a particularly good job, we mention it, or if they're doing a particularly bad job, we chide them a little bit on this. So that whole question of economic disadvantage is an issue that's really been at the forefront in the last few editions, and I suspect that the racism issue is going to be similar in the next few editions.
So do you, like, when you have when the students are asked to do the questionnaires, do you try to encourage the colleges to include diversity in who answers those questionnaires as well? Yes.
And I think from now on, we're going to be a little bit more explicit in when they say in our instructions. Before we said, give us a cross section of students, and we want students who've been there for at least a couple of years. But I think from now on, we're also going to say, among your students, please include some racial and ethnic diversity. We've taken a lot of note of it in the write-ups, but in the student questionnaires, that's an area where we're going to be a bit more explicit. So yeah, we try to be sensitive to changing culture and hence to the changing needs and interests of the writer, of the readers, the parents, and the students. I've always been a big fan of HBCUs. I think they're probably some of the best run universities, college universities in the country. And a place like Spelman College is, one of my friends was president many years ago, and it's just a absolutely fascinating institution for what its history, and I love telling the story of a place like that. Same with Xavier University in New Orleans. It's the only Roman Catholic HBCU that they've turned out. Something like a majority of the African American science teachers in the country, or at least in that area, have come from Xavier. So there's just a lot of interesting stories to tell about these schools, and that's what makes doing the guide fun.
Oh, definitely. So there are a number of questions that people are asking about, right now. And for the last few years, people are worried about the financial stability of colleges. Is that something that's taken into consideration? And do you ask questions about that in terms of colleges and their financial stability?
That's not what I'm basically doing is presenting the school to the way it exists to the reader. Now, the most obvious way in which the financial situation would be relevant would be if they have had to cut faculty members or to take other steps to alter what they're offering to students. So we will take note of that. And for example, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we talked, the governor has brought huge cuts to the aid. So if the public, and it's not, there are other public systems have had problems. So we will mention that that they have been facing financial problems, but we're basically talking about here's what you're going to find when you get there, and we're not trying to make any predictions about whether you'll still even be there 10 years from now. That's not what we're about. Okay. We're trying to serve the readers.
Well, and again, it goes back to that it is a publication that you want to, that readers will use and refer and, come back to year after year. But there is an affordability. So somebody asked, well, how do you calculate? So in the ratings, one of them is affordability. So is it based on what you talked about in terms of percentage of Pell Grant recipients or percentage of need met? How does the affordability rating?
Well, we don't have an affordability ranking per se, a rating per se, but
so it just says
we have a list of, every year we pick a list of bargains, what we think are the best buys is what we call it. So 10 publics and 10 privates. And that's, we look at, we publish the debt level that graduates end up with. And so we look at some of their data on financial aid, and we look at the resulting debt loads. So you may have a college that has a generous scholarship financial aid program, but most of the aid is in the form of loans. Mm-hmm. And so you have a school that sort of looks like a real bargain, except the result is students end up with huge amounts of debt. So we look at a bunch of these figures, and then we come up with a list of, here are 10 schools you might want to look at that seem to be doing a pretty good job. And you always come back to the fact, this is basic admissions 101, that it all depends on the situation of the individual student, and the school, and how much the school wants that individual student. So it's very difficult to generalize because, again, college schools are playing it so cute. And it's like, every American knows that when you walk into a used car dealer, you look at the sticker price and then kick the tires and stick your hands in your pocket and say, okay, now what's it going to cost me? And so that's sweeping generalizations probably don't have any credibility. But we try to identify a number of schools that we think are are good bets for in general. But again, it goes back to that individual situation. I mean, North Carolina, for example, the tuition for the Paul University by state law is pretty low. And there are other states with a SUNY system, especially if you're a New York resident. There are a lot of good bargains there.
Good.
But bargain, of course, is relative.
Well, that's very true.
How long do you want to be an indentured servant in your own country?
So with your new book, show us your cover again. Is there anything new or something that we should be aware of and looking for in this new edition?
Well, I think one of the themes I've been trying to stress is sort of the continuity that, again, I go back to the American higher education is really fascinating, and it's got all of these schools with interesting personalities and cultures, and events swirl around them. But the basic the basic nature of the schools tends to be fairly constant. So even with COVID and all of the disruptions and the changes and the hectic situation of what's happening with testing, with SATs and ACTs, we are incidentally going to stop publishing SAT ranges, at least for the next few years, because the data is no longer reliable, with so many colleges going test optional, and so many students unable to take the tests. And the SATs and ACTs have always favored the wealthy because they can afford tutoring. So there's some racial injustice built in the system in the first place. But now the statistics, the numbers, the ranges are now essentially meaningless. And we don't like publishing meaningless information. So we're just going to stop dealing with the test. And we'll see. I mean, by 2 or 3 years from now, it may be that the whole testing, the use of tests is different from anything that we now see. I mean, it's not outside the realm of possibility that the testing is going to disappear as an important factor. But we're not in the business of printing dubious information. So we're just going to stop dealing with them for a while anyway.
So are there, well, that's very good to hear. And that's very good for us to know.
The counselors like to hear that.
Yes, they do. So we're getting some questions on for-profit schools. You don't have any for-profit schools in the Fiske guide, do you?
No.
Okay. That's what I thought.
No, but basically looking at 4-year, with one exception, Deep Springs is an unusual story out in California, but we're basically dealing with 4-year nonprofit undergraduate institutions. I mean, the university with undergraduates would be included. But.
So do you update, does every school get an update in the guide every year?
Yep.
And are you dropping any schools or adding any schools in this?
We do drop schools from time to time. I'm just trying. Well, we dropped Adelphi for a while because they were having some governance scandals where the state board of regents fired almost all of their trustees. And that was interesting.
That's a problem.
Well, and we basically said it's an example of how not to run a school. But Adelphi also happens to be the first book is AD. So it was the first school in the book alphabetically. And we didn't want to start out on a sour note with a description of a school as the example of how not to be a school. So we dropped it for a while, but then they got some new leadership and they did a really good comeback. And so they're back in the book, and a couple of others have been dropped along the way. But I'm trying to be open to adding new ones. But then it's a question of space. As I say, my wife says it's already too big.
Well, you can tell her that all the counselors, advisors disagree.
But yeah, we do drop schools like that. And occasionally there'll be schools that just really won't cooperate with us. And so there's at least one school this year that we're dropping for that reason. But we've been very patient, but anyway.
Well, coming from a technology background and format, I understand that totally, because we run into that issue sometimes too. Because if you can't get the data, you can't get the feedback, then it makes it, you don't have anything to.
Yeah. But by and large, schools are really cooperative. It's good. It's good publicity for them, and we're essentially, from the point of view of the school, we're trying to tell their story.
Well, and people always have, like, people are saying, well, what about University of Montana or Landmark College? And I mean, there are other colleges definitely that could be, I mean, you could create a whole nother book with a whole nother list of colleges, I'm sure. So one of the questions, Ted, is like, what about a regional or an international? Because we have so many international. Have that ever been explored?
International colleges or students?
A book of Fiske Guide for International Colleges.
No, that's just another whole massive research project. This is a theme I probably should have mentioned. From a long time ago, I've tried to emphasize some international options for American students. So we've had the four major Canadian universities in it for a long time. We've had write-ups about the 4 historic Scottish universities. We've added Trinity College Dublin, which is a major one in Ireland. And I've spent a lot of time living in other countries and writing about education in other countries. So I really think it's important. And if you're an American, if I were going to college, I would seriously think about looking, if not up north, looking to Scotland. For one thing, University of Edinburgh is no further away than UC Berkeley if you live in Boston or New York. And the chance in a globally connected world to go to a school where you're rubbing elbows with people from all around the world. If you're sitting in Glasgow or Edinburgh or St. Andrews, you can go to Paris for the weekend. Right. Just get a Ryanair flight. And so the chance to rub elbows, and then once you graduate, you have friends all over the world whom you can go visit for the rest of your life. So it's the idea of getting an internationally oriented education is really attractive. And so I've tried to present this to readers of the book, and we talk a little bit about what it's like to have an experience in another country. So, and then another theme is schools that in the U.S. that emphasize international aspects. We have places like Kalamazoo, for example, which has been doing that for years. So that's another thing that we, for many years, I've tried to, as a matter of as a conscious decision to talk about international perspectives and how many international students they have, and then how they've what sort of study abroad programs they have, and the number of study abroad programs has mushroomed over the last decade or so. And so we try to be responsive to readers, not only what student readers want to know, but what we think they should know in terms of options.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we are almost out of time. Is there anything else that you would like to share? Any piece of advice or thought that you would like to share with those of us who work directly with students and parents about, this process, education in general? You said, this is a topic you've written about for years. So any other thoughts?
I think we've covered most of the things. I mean, I would just go back to the basic point that the diversity of U.S. higher education is phenomenal. I don't like using the word unique, but it really is in terms of the diversity of options that are available to you in the U.S. are greater than any other country in the world. And so the fact is, leaving aside prestige and test scores and all that stuff, the fact is that for any particular individual, there are literally dozens of schools that would be a good match. And it's just a question of trying to find a school where this individual, or the personality of the school is going to serve your own particular needs. And the odds of, and we feel like we're helping students do this, find a school that looks like a personality, and a good match. And the odds of your landing in a school that's going to be a good match are hugely in your favor, because there are so many out there. And so it's just take advantage of the richness of the American system of higher education, because it's a real national treasure.
Well, thank you. I think that's a good point to end with. And Ted, thank you for being a guest. We've had over 220, I've been keeping track, 247, almost 250 people. So thank you to everyone that's been here today too. You have a lot of fans out there and people who really do rely on the book, and just hearing from you personally, your approach and validation of the college process in our higher education system in the United States is very uplifting. And that is something we all need right now, I think, in many ways. So thank you. If they want to order a copy of your book, what do you recommend?
bn.com or Amazon or any good bookseller is going to have it.
Okay. All right. Definitely. I will order my copy, add it to all the other copies that I have. And thank you again. And please be safe and be well. Everyone, join me again in 2 weeks. I won't have a session next Friday, but the Friday after, we'll watch my website and watch your email for an announcement as to who our guest speaker is going to be in 2 weeks. And thank you very much, Ted. This has been great.
Yeah, good luck to all.
And this concludes our session for today. Thank you, everyone. And everybody's just saying thank you to you for everything that you've done. So I hope you can feel that love and warmth that everybody is sending to you.
Okay, I can feel it.
All right. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.